Welcome back to the Now Morning Show. Just 6:25 a.m. in Trinidad and Tobago. And this morning we're focusing on hypertension. Joining us from Tobago is Ronique Thomas, a dietitian at the Community Nutrition Unit of the Tobago Regional Health Authority. Good morning, Ronique, and welcome.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you with us on the show, hoping that your morning is off to a great start and looking forward to this conversation particularly. Now, Ronique, I know that we're going into dietary approaches, but if we could just backtrack a little bit and get to the foundation of hypertension. Specifically, can you give us a definition of hypertension?
So, hypertension, or what we commonly describe as high blood pressure, it's basically described as when you have a systolic blood pressure of over 140 and your diastolic is over 90. So that is how we tend to classify someone as being hypertensive, right? And we also have other classifications like pre-hypertension, where anywhere over 120, over 80, you will be diagnosed as, having pre-hypertension.
Are there any particular groups that can be predisposed to hypertension, Ronique?
So yes, there are certain groups who are predisposed to having hypertension. Not necessarily saying that they are necessarily persons that if you have these things, you definitely will develop hypertension. But, persons who carry excess weight or who are obese, and persons, of course, of a certain particular race. There are also like persons who are genetically predisposed to developing hypertension as well. So yes, there are groups who are at a higher risk of the development of hypertension.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, sometimes we hear about at-risk groups, particularly the older generation and so much more. What are your thoughts on that? Is that something that we are just paying too much attention to, or should we give some specific attention to the older generation for hypertension?
No, we absolutely should pay attention to the older generation when it comes to hypertension. We do find hypertension occurring more commonly within those older age ranges, but we try to place focus too on the younger age groups as well, because as we are seeing more and more persons, more and more young people are being diagnosed with hypertension. So now we have a situation where we have to place focus on the entire population in trying to share strategies to help persons in combating, this health condition. So yes, the older generation, we do place emphasis on them ensuring that, they know their numbers, they are regularly screened and checked for hypertension, but we want it to be an overall approach where we target, the entire population, inclusive of the youths and young people.
Okay, Ronique, so let's shift the conversation to the younger generation. It's not something that we would have heard, I would say, maybe growing up with younger generation really suffering from hypertension. What would you say are some of the contributing factors that have increased over the years to bring us to this point?
I think what plays a very high role in this is, physical inactivity and leading sedentary lifestyles. We are not as active anymore. Our diet as well. We tend to focus more on consuming a lot of processed foods, a lot of fast foods, and you see that shift as a result of those things towards more and more younger persons being diagnosed with this health condition.
It's interesting that you mentioned like fast foods, because automatically many times people will think about things like cholesterol because of the oil and all of the other components that go into this high turnover food industry. What about the excessive sodium? Because that's the first thing that really pops into mind when we think about hypertension. How does that come into the mix?
So yes, most of your processed foods, fast foods, convenience foods, they are prepared with a high percentage of salt, and not just the normal salt that we use, table salt, as we say. Some of these foods are prepared with a lot of what we know as pack seasonings, a lot of other ingredients that contain high sodium, like your salted butters. So there is use of a high amount of ingredients which contributes to the overall salt makeup of that food. And that is why we encourage a lot of persons or ask everyone generally to pay attention to, your fast food intake, watch your processed foods, read your nutrition facts, labels, and all of these different things, so that you're not placed at increased risk of, having too much excess sodium in your diet.
Ronique, one of the things that you just mentioned would have been reading your labels. These nutrition labels we see all the time, we don't necessarily pay attention to them. But when it comes now to this conversation and sodium, what would you recommend be somebody's daily intake in order to be preventative to hypertension rather?
So there is a range or a recommendation for your sodium intake. You're supposed to actually be having less than 2,000 milligrams, and that is actually close to approximately 1 teaspoon. Now, when you think about how we usually prepare foods, we would actually use 1 teaspoon in one meal. So it's less than 2,000 milligrams, according to the World Health Organization, and they advise even less than that for persons who are hypertensive. So it's closer to around 1,500 or less milligrams of sodium if you're hypertensive.
You know, Ronique, I automatically think about the way that we cook on a Sunday, particularly, where we just grab and we pour and we say, all right, that's enough, not necessarily measuring. So it's definitely a shift that has to take place and a behavioral pattern change. What strategies would you be able to recommend to us this morning to start to reduce our sodium intake?
Yes, so we are culturally a people who love highly seasoned foods. We use our salts, we use our pack seasonings, and we tend to load up on those. We try to encourage persons as much as possible to try to use your fresh seasonings when you're seasoning your foods. Try to give the foods a natural flavor from, like your herbs and your spices, as opposed to relying too heavily on adding extra salts and adding extra, pack seasonings. That is going to be one of the dietary approaches in terms of paying attention to your salt intake. But the research actually shows that it's not only about the amount of salt we add in cooking, but paying attention as well to your processed foods intake. Look at your intake of things like your processed meats. So how often you're having things like your sausages and your bacon and those other processed meats which have a high salt content. You want to watch out for those type of things. Watch out for how often you consume fast foods and that sort of thing. So those contribute as well in terms of, the dietary intake of salt. But when it comes to our cooking, watch how much salt you're adding. And of course, pay attention to your use of these processed foods in cooking.
Ronique, one of the things that we do see many people adhering to now is a school of thought where you just completely cut out things. One of those being sodium, a very hard and fast approach. What are your thoughts on that?
So we always tell persons it's not that your body needs no sodium. Your body does need sodium in order to function and to operate. It helps you to maintain a fluid balance. So it's not about completely cutting out sodium at all. And that is a very difficult feat to achieve, because sodium is found in so many different foods, naturally even occurring in some foods. So it's not maybe possible to cut out all, and it's all about looking at how much and paying attention to how much you're adding and cutting back in terms of how much of the foods you're going to season. Simple processes where you can eliminate using like the table salt. We encourage persons to try and do that, because not everything we cook, we have to use the salt in. Right. So it's all about watching moderation, because it's absolutely not a case where your body does not need any sodium at all.
Understood. Another thing that we also see becoming popular are reduced sodium items. So like soy sauce, says reduced sodium. Even some of these salts that we're seeing right now, they say it has a less level. Would you recommend that these are also incorporated into your diet?
Yes. So pay attention to your nutrition facts labels. Some of the time you will see items marked as reduced sodium or low sodium. Be aware of the fact that a label that reads reduced sodium does not mean that this product does not have any sodium at all. Specifically, if you are hypertensive, you still want to pay attention to labels that have just reduced sodium. If you see low sodium, then chances are it is a very low sodium product, but be very mindful of when you see it, labeled as just reduced sodium. And also pay attention to the fact that many of the foods that have been modified so that it is reduced sodium food, they are going to add other different types of things to give the food the flavor, because it's all about, making sure that the consumers are satisfied and making sure that the consumers continue to purchase these different products. So always read your nutrition facts labels so that you're always mindful of what you are getting when it comes to these food products.
No, Ronique, you just mentioned flavor, something that, of course, is critical to our kitchens and to our palates. One of the things that we haven't touched on are condiments. We've spoken about our seasonings, our salt, and so much more, but we also love, a little ketchup, a little mustard, a little garlic sauce, a little shadow benny sauce. If it's one thing we can do, we can turn anything into a sauce in Trinidad and Tobago. What about their relationship to sodium and levels?
So condiments are one of the food items that are known for having hidden salts. So things like your soy sauce and your ketchup and your garlic sauce and these types of things, commercially, they do tend to carry hidden salts. So it is a food that we try to always encourage persons to be very mindful of how much you're putting, because of course moderation is key. It's not that we would tell persons you can't have ketchup or you can't use soy sauce or you can't use any of these condiments, but you always want to be mindful of the serving sizes, how much you're going to use, particularly if you're hypertensive, because of course, the more that you use of the product, it's the more sodium you're going to get, depending on how much sodium that food product has. So you always want to be mindful of how much you are using.
And Ronique, our final question before we close our conversation this morning. When do you recommend we start looking into testing for hypertension?
So the way in which things are going of late, I would say that we start testing from as young as possible. Not necessarily, very young children, but from the time you are an adult, you are 18 years and over, you want to start getting regular health checks. You want to start knowing your numbers. Not to say that young people or young children do not have hypertension, because there have been scenarios and cases where we see very young children with hypertension as well. But from the time you are an adult, you are 18 years or older, we encourage all persons to start doing regular health checks, know your numbers, and be aware of your health status. Because it's a very good practice to have moving forward as you get older and you age.
Well, Ronique, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been a pleasure. Have an excellent day and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you so much. Same to you.
Ronique Thomas, dietitian from the Community Nutrition Unit of the Tobago Regional Health Authority, with us this morning speaking about hypertension. Stay tuned. There's more coming up on the Now Morning Show after this break.